I'm going to do a few points of housekeeping just to start with. For those of you that are unfamiliar with Zoom, in the top right-hand corner, if you select speaker view, that will be your most helpful view. So that means that you will always see the person that's speaking. Also, the format we're going to be using is that all four of our speakers are going to offer their presentations. And then at the end, we'll open up the chat and we'll have a shared Q&A. So if you have any questions while someone's presenting, you could note them down. You're also welcome to direct them to me within the chat or any of us that are co-hosting. We will see that if you direct a question to us, but I ask you not to direct them to the presenter until they're finished in case they are distracted by it. That's the whole conference is being run that way in the hope that the person can simply present. Of course, they may have a shared screen, but that's something else. Okay, so I think there's two people recording, so the recording can now begin. I'll start the introductions. This session is called Holistic and Contemplative Education Scholars Panel, and there are four presenters. We'll be starting with Dr. Ehaab Abdou. Dr. Abdou is Assistant Professor of Global Studies and Social Entrepreneurship at the Department of Global Studies, Wilfrid Laurier University, Waterloo. His research seeks to promote the inclusion of marginalized narratives and perspectives. The title for his talk today is Reflecting on the Meditative Inquiry Volume in relation to contemplative practices in the classroom. Our second speaker will be Dr. Alexandra Fidyk. Dr. Fidyk is a poet, philosopher, and professor for the Faculty of Education, University of Alberta. Her transdisciplinary research engages with youth and teachers on issues of well-being, mental health, and soul voice using somasensorial, contemplative, relational, and creative processes. The title for her talk today is Silence as Generative Process and Practice. Our third speaker will be Martin Morrison. Martin Morrison is a two-time graduate from Mount St. Vincent University and a current PhD candidate. His dissertation explores the themes and characteristics of teachers who have been identified as being culturally responsive to the needs of African Nova Scotian learners. The title for his talk today is Exploring the Implications of Meditative Inquiry on Culturally Relevant and Responsive Pedagogy and the African Nova Scotian Dream Keepers. Finally, Dr. Darlene St. George will present. Dr. St. George is a visual artist, poet, and creation-centered scholar. She is currently Assistant Professor of Art Education at University of Lethbridge. Her theoretical and practice-based research recognizes the creative, critical, spiritual, and performative ways of knowing in the world. The title of her talk today is Visual and Poetic Storying, Threads of Creation-Centered Practice. Okay, so now we're going to be starting with Dr. Abdou, and I'm just going to ask for your patience.
Alex Bonnie, Alex agreed to do it.
Agreed. Oh, I'm sorry. We are going to be starting with a meditation, and Alex Fidyk has agreed to start that. So I'm going to spotlight her now. Just a moment. There it is. Okay. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Hello from Treaty 6, Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. I invite each of you to acknowledge your place and ancestors in this brief meditation. It's called Soft, Slow, and Somatic. So to begin, I invite everybody to do a little kind of wiggle and shake with your body. I see nobody wants to do it on screen, so I will. Yes, thank you, Ehaab. That's fabulous. And then I invite everyone to place your feet, both of them. If you have access or if you're in a chair, you can use pedals. If you would ground both feet on the floor or wherever you are. And I'm going to walk you through a meditation that has very few words. So first, and you might want to look at me before you do this. So first, there's the attention to breath. So in through the mouth, if you're able, and out through your nose. And the first movement we're going to do with soft eyes. And many of us, when we look at the screen, use sharper eyes. But even if you can just blink a couple of times and soften your eyes, but not close them, we're going to start head forward. And as we breathe, I'm going to invite you to turn your whole head and your eyes to your left, often considered the west or the mother line. So we're going to turn fully and slowly to the left as you breathe as far as you can without strain. Come back to center slowly. We're just moving head and neck. And now we're moving all the way, if you can, to your right shoulder, slowly as you breathe. And then come back to center, the right or the east or father line. Then we'll do the same, but don't move your head, just turn your eyes. So go with your eyes slowly to the right as far as you can. Come back to center, keeping your head straight, move your eyes to the left, and then come back to center. And then take a nice breath and exhale. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very peaceful beginning. Okay, I'm going to, sorry, a few more people have arrived, so everything is shifted down. I am going to remove your spotlight. Okay, I'm passing over to you, Dr. Abdou.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Bonnie, and thank you very much, Alex, for this wonderful meditation. It's a real privilege to be with all of you today. Thank you very much for the invitation. Martin was very humbly saying earlier that he's a newcomer to meditative inquiry. I feel the same. So it's a real privilege to be here to reflect with all of you on this wonderful journey. Congratulations on the edited volume, and thanks again for the invitation. I would start by sharing that I'm joining you from Washington, D.C., the traditional territory of some wonderful indigenous peoples groups, the Nakochtank and Anacostan and Pamunkey, among other indigenous peoples. I would like to share my gratitude for everything they've been doing over the past millennia, stewards of the land and all the living beings on this.
Sorry,
on this
Ehaab, I'm just interrupting you. Is the sound coming from your background? Because I see all.
Yeah, there's a little bit of background noise, unfortunately. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I just
okay,
wanted to make sure. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Ashwin. So I just wanted to start by this sharing this gratitude, and then I also would like to thank my dear colleague and friend and also mentor, Shwani Kumar. It's a privilege to be here. I don't think we've met in person, but just to we met through the CACS, the Canadian Association for Curriculum Studies, and also he's been a very generous guest speaker to a few of my classes as well, sharing some insights into meditative inquiry. And he's also very generously joined us for a weekend on multi-faith approaches to contemplative practices last summer. So thank you very much for this invitation. And also I've had the privilege of listening to some of Ashwani's music in that weekend retreat, which was really wonderful. Just maybe a very quick background about myself, just to give you an idea about where some of my comments are coming from. Meditative inquiry and contemplative practices have been a wonderful entry point for me to continue on a quest to reconnect with some of my own indigenous wisdom traditions. I'm Egyptian, and part of this journey has been reconnecting a little bit with my ancient Egyptian wisdom tradition, which is, as many of you would know, sometimes not a very easy journey to try to reconcile with some of these ancient wisdom traditions or indigenous wisdom traditions that have been misrepresented and sometimes vilified for a long time. So thank you for that opportunity and that also space to reconcile and look at that differently. And I'll end just by saying that I'm also currently working on two projects where meditative inquiry has been really inspiring for me. One is an edited volume where we're looking together with various scholars from across the world, including indigenous scholars from the North American context, at representations of ancient and indigenous wisdom traditions in curricula. So meditative inquiry comes in very centrally to that conversation, as well as also inspiring some of my ongoing work preparing for a course on global wisdom traditions and education, as I'll share a little bit. So I just wanted to share that bit of a background because many of my comments will be centering around how is the background noise, Ashwani and others? I hope it's not.
It comes in swells, but it's
okay.
current, yes.
Okay, let me just give me one. All right, I'm sorry about that. So I'm just going to continue and hope the background noise will stop. All right, so all right, thank you very much for your patience. So I'm just going to reflect on a couple of things in this presentation. Some of the reflections are drawing on meditative inquiry in my classroom teaching and practices, as well as also how the edited volume, which I really enjoyed reading and seeing some of the beautiful contributions, and as well as the illustrations, how this will, I think, continue to inspire entry points towards more holistic approaches in my teaching. So maybe starting with some reflections on drawing on meditative inquiry. So I would say meditative inquiry or contemplative practices have really served as very important triggers towards more profound and sustained engagement. This entailed, in some cases, offering some of my students spaces to critically reflect on their positionality and their lived experiences. So we have this anonymous reflection where they handwrite a paragraph about an experience where they felt excluded for any of their identity markers or race, ethnicity, gender, and so on. And then we reflect as a group on how this is situated within dominant systems, structures, and discourses. So I would say this was one space as a trigger for, and also using this contemplative practice towards maybe digging into deeper questions and systems and so on. Other exercises entailed also exercises inspired by approaches to systems thinking, as well as mapping our systems, including, for instance, the Global Map the System competition organized by Oxford University, which I've been working on with some of our student groups on. Finally, and I think connecting the two together has been the exercise of spheres of influence, where we go through the various spheres of influence that students have, their private, their social network, their institutions, and then to the larger systems, and seeing how also we can turn some of this understanding of the problem and some of the issues and their mapping into spaces where they can feel their sense of agency towards changing some of that. I would say meditative inquiry, of course, offers a much deeper connection on that meditative and personal reflection part that maybe we're still grappling with, but that definitely is a reminder for us to continue to try to work. We've also had some guest speakers, including Ashwani Kumar's insights into meditative inquiry, which I could see how inspiring it's been for my students, especially in their subsequent reflections on that. Just to share, in the title here, I'm saying triggers because I believe that we still, maybe we've introduced our students to some of the ideas, but I'm still struggling a little bit with going beyond those triggers. How do we continue to go deeper and sustain such contemplative and more holistic approaches and practices by drawing on meditative inquiry and its emphasis on sustained self-reflective and contemplative approaches, also drawing on Ashwani's key seven principles that he had kindly shared with us in this edited volume, as well as in this morning. Maybe inspired by Martin's title, I stole this here a little bit and included the culturally responsive pedagogy, but I also have seen how meditative inquiry and these approaches could offer a space for that culturally responsive pedagogy. I'm sure Martin will go much deeper into that, but just a couple of quick insights to that. So in the student-led and run contemplative exercises, where each class we start off with asking a student to choose a contemplative exercise, and I very gently ask them to draw on their own cultural backgrounds and wisdom traditions. This has really been very inspiring, but maybe falling a little bit short, but it's a good start or a good trigger. But despite being encouraged to draw on their own traditions, I think it's because of this issue that many of the contributors to the edited volume have highlighted, this idea of religion and the state and church and state. Some of them don't necessarily feel very comfortable drawing on, maybe at least explicitly in the exercises they chose, to draw on their own wisdom traditions or spiritual backgrounds, which I find interesting. So some of my ongoing reflections that I would like to share with you as part of this conversation, how can we be prepared to more proactively and boldly engage and encourage our students to and ourselves to also engage in uncomfortable discussions or uncomfortable conversations, to borrow Bill Piner's, including shortcomings, for instance, posed by instrumentalism, as Kumar Sharia and Kumar have remind us. To how do we make sure that we're not just focusing, as my students would have focused on stress relief or mental well-being and mindfulness, but going beyond those, for instance. How can we also engage with historical injustices and exclusionary social structures and practices that have been endured by, but also sometimes propagated by these same wisdom traditions that I'm trying to draw on, or we're trying to draw on in some of our conversations. Another question that I continue to also think about how to bring it to our conversation is to how do we encourage students to be more comfortable, forthcoming and confident about drawing on and presenting their own and their community's cultural backgrounds and wisdom traditions when they're bringing in their contemplative practices and meditative practices into the classroom. The second and the final part of my presentation, I just wanted to share a few insights into how this edited volume has continued to and will continue to inspire some of my current and upcoming work. Again, it's a beautiful piece of art and work, and it's a real privilege to have read through it and being inspired by it. So as I mentioned, I'm developing currently a course on with the title of Global Wisdom Traditions and Education, where we hopefully grappling with questions of how faith-based or religious-based education looks like, how are representations of various traditions happening in various curricula, how are these being enacted by teachers in the classroom, and so on. So I'm very much excited about designing and teaching that course, and very much also inspired by meditative inquiry and how that could be part and parcel of that whole unpacking these processes. So finding ways to question and challenge colonial and capitalist forces which have undermined and marginalized non-Eurocentric ways of being and knowing, citing Ashwani here. I think meditative inquiry allows us and encourages us to do that. So I find that very helpful in the case of trying to look at global wisdom traditions and their relationship with education, which is sometimes contentious, and finding ways to reintroduce, restore, and restoring the value of various ways of knowing that have been negated or perhaps misrepresented as background or superstitions, as we've seen in a lot of maybe literature informed by dominant perspectives of modern education or informed by movements such as the Enlightenment, for instance. So I would say meditative inquiry as moving forward in trying to grapple with these questions and trying to find spaces for reconciliation and dialogue invites several, and I find this in much of the edited volume, inspires a lot of these conversations in terms of trying to include some of those wisdom traditions, such as the indigenous ways of knowing and being, including perhaps through the advent and conversions to some dominant world religions in various contexts that might have further been distanced by other lenses or other worldviews such as the Enlightenment and embodying that in modern education and so on. And I cite
Dr.
over here-
Abdou, this is a 3-minute warning, okay?
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much. I would add to that as well that I see meditative inquiry as well as the edited volume inviting us to not only look at indigenous ways of knowing and being and finding ways to engage with that in such endeavors, but also other traditionally marginalized perspectives and worldviews, including Afrocentrist perspectives. I see also Brigham has included the ancient Egyptian Ma'at concept and other. I would add to that Ache by our earlier speaker and Ubuntu and other African indigenous religion, where these are more gently invited into as part of the conversation as opposed to being negated, misrepresented, or being part of that hierarchy where some of the other dominant wisdom traditions are seen as maybe supreme or superior or part of that linear progress of the advent of wisdom traditions. And I would add to that also, I think meditative inquiry invites us to reconnect with vernacular popular beliefs. I think also modern education informed by much of the Enlightenment movement perhaps has also negated, and I see that very clearly in the case of Egypt, for instance, the vernacular and popular beliefs and has sacrificed that to maybe a dominant interpretation or dominant institutional understanding of these dominant religions, whether Christianity or Islam, for instance. So drawing on the idea of intuition and intrinsic intelligence, for instance, as Kumar tells us, or Ovid's insights about how we bring in also prayerful rituals on the land and meditation and so on, which have in many ways been, even for people who have embraced some of the dominant world religions, Christianity and Islam and so on, in various parts of the world, these have been some of their ways of reconciling with some of their ancient wisdom traditions in a syncretic practice and syncretic manner. So, and how can meditative inquiry perhaps, and I see a lot of potential to invite back some of those that have been maybe again negated as superstition or backward or primitive perhaps in some of our curricula and some of our classroom, the dominant classroom practices. And finally, I would say also this meditative inquiry, I see it as an invitation to bring in some also sideline mystical traditions within dominant wisdom traditions, including Kabbalah in Judaism, Christian mysticism, Sufism, and so on. That could be also offering very good spaces for dialogue and reconciliation with some of these indigenous and ancient wisdom traditions that have been perhaps sidelined or not drawn on. And finally, I would also say the edited volume has been very inspiring in the efforts by some of the scholars, including Muhammad Kharbash's contribution about trying to see how we can also bring in critical discourse analysis with meditative inquiry. So I plan to continue to draw on that space. I would add maybe here one thing that I thought would also be helpful, and maybe I didn't see it as centrally highlighted, is the historical perspective. Maybe so I would also, in addition to bringing critical discourse analysis, try to perhaps draw on the historical dimension, draw on some work of people like and inspiring scholars such as Foucault or Austrian scholar Fidyk on discourse historical approaches. So these are some questions. I hope I didn't overwhelm you with some of my own thinkings of what's going on in my head. Again, thank you very much for this opportunity. It's a privilege to be with all of you, and I look forward to other presentations and discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your thoughtful comments. What we're going to do now, Abdou, Dr. Abdou, is I'm going to pass over the spotlight, and then we're going to bring you back in at the end for the panel discussion. So now I'm passing it over to Dr. Fidyk.
Great, thank you. Just a second. Okay. So this presentation is enacted as a breath response in the form of lyrical storying. While simple, it embodies insights and practices gleaned from Eastern philosophies, process philosophy, Jungian psychoanalysis, indigenous knowledge systems, and trauma studies. It seeks to perform meditative inquiry in an animate paradigm. So I invite you to relax and to soften as I begin. So the title is slightly changed: Silence, Generative Creative Process. Growing up in rural places, a particular land, its foliage and feathers, its pulse never leaves you. It might be described as knowing self is not confined to a body, that soul and place enfold, that fluidity exists in and out and through all things. Two inseparable aspects, self and place, soul and matter, held by a creative impulse within an undifferentiated whole. Growing up small in Canadian Prairie on a self-sustaining family farm made for a radically different childhood than most today. As Wallace Stegner describes, there is something about living in big space where people are few and distant under a great sky that is alternately serene and furious. There is something about exposure to that big country. I witnessed and was part of life's cycles unfolding, mating, birthing, dying, and knew that my existence was intricately interwoven with theirs. Such immersion led to merging, that experience where the edges of things blur, even dissolve or invert the imposed divisions of subject and object. Merging is below or beyond ego, describes analyst Jane Hollister Wheelwright. It's like the earliest mother-child experience. Land as mother, returning to the source, like being back in the ocean submerged. This symbiotic relationship between self and wilderness, a psycho-spiritual experience, drew me down to the deeper psychic layers, to the world of the archetypes, including the self. Archetypes are an organizing and creating impulse towards fuller becoming. As energetic wholes, their parts traced complementary opposites that were never separate. This is my entry to meditative inquiring, living deeply in place, in relation to fields, drought, night skies, harsh weather, and my horse, with flooded roads in spring, always connected with air, soil, and divisive politics, and other elements with which our lives were intimately interwoven in a whole cosmic continuum. My childhood and youth lived in sustainable farming, extended family, and interdependent rural communities was experienced as a caring obligation, where what we did was caring as doing, a life-sustaining practice as care as situated. Care with conscious and unconscious limits, though. There was exclusion, racism, sexism, and violence. Each task of creation is a social effort, employing the whole universe. Meditative inquiry as social effort is attentiveness to life, to daily life, an emergent process, an art of listening, and an engaged practice, learning from and through silence. Critical to our ongoing climate crisis, COVID pandemic, pervasive racism, hatred, wars, and an unrecognized trauma epidemic, meditative inquiry offers a much needed approach for transformative potentialities, including collective healing. Meditative inquiry is an exploration within oneself and of how one is connected to life relationally, ecologically, economically, politically, and culturally. It is this existential and social exploration that can underwrite profound change, because it can undo learning and believing and redo from another ethno-onto epistemology. What is wise and necessary about meditative inquiry? It can attend perceived and real boundaries, such as spirit murder. It draws ancient intercultural pathways into the present in meaningful ways. It can integrate and be integrated into multiple perspectives, including, but not limited to, Afrocentricity, indigenous knowledge systems, wisdom traditions, including Egyptian, especially Tao, Buddhist, and Vedantic philosophies. It recognizes and values both intrapsychic and interpersonal experiences. It crosses and troubles historical and research paradigms. It requires embodied awareness and deep critical redress of consciousness that continues to be divisive. Meditative inquiry invites us wholeness. Its etymological root conjoins holy and healing. Whole includes the unseen, unthinkable, and unspeakable. With amplified division, fear, and reduced physiological capacity, a general state of many people today, pause, breathe, and empty provides a critical, slow beginning if we are to perceive and respond in new ways. With amplified division, fear, and reduced physiological capacity, oops, that's a repeat. Sorry about that. Pause, breathe, and empty, meant both literally and metaphorically here, provides a necessary place to reflect, restore, re-examine, reconsider, reimagine, recreate, and a host of other responses, including slow. Central to this movement, yet often missed, is silence. Silence is an active experience, a force, a pre-conscious energy, and the necessary ground for building knowledge between the self and the world. As David Jeffrey Smith says, meaningfulness always contains an absence as well as a presence, and silence is as much as declaration. Silence is a meditative process and can arouse creativity. When the ego mind grows quiet, a door opens to the unknown, to a gap, to a place where things can emerge. Silence too relies on attentiveness. Such attentiveness is a form of love, prayer, humility. Attentiveness is where education begins. As Helen Lees, one of our earlier panelists, writes, there's nothing wrong with silence as a resource if it is strong, and strong is her word for positive forms of silence. It is an astonishing educational resource. Silence is not a thing or a small something for education. It is a punch of immense force. Silence as a practice, an attitude, and an experience is freedom. Silence is kin to poetry, art, and other forms of creative expression, for it can go beyond the limits of words to deal with the unspeakable in psychologically extreme states. And I think now of trauma torture, a topic that I've begun to study and one that many people don't want to talk about or acknowledge. For Max Picard, an early researcher in silence, he says, poetry is a mosaic inlaid into silence. Poetry and art are ways into others' realities. An encounter with the other implies an encounter with the self. Poetry is both a working out of something and an offering for further interpretation and response. It is in such encounters that silence is essential to the process of coming to understand the unknown, the unlimited, in seeing possibilities and human potential. And yet, as it asks the poet to return to the world and to other, it asserts an ethical awareness and responsibility. Such ethical awareness means a responsibility based on appreciation, respect, care, and interrelatedness. It means embracing the world as poets and artists trying somehow to become what we behold. It means being unself-conscious about these things regarding poetry, like love, as a byproduct rather than an intention. It means living a life of cultivated presence.
It's a 3-minute warning, Dr. Fidyk.
Thank you. We gain depth and richness in knowing by participation or through engaged presence with others, through poetry, art, and nature. Relationship, more precisely relating, is fundamental to learning, teaching, living, and becoming more whole. Relationships demand attentiveness, as Martha Nussbaum says, an openness to being moved by the plight of others, the willingness to be touched by another's life. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a very calm presentation. And that brings us now to Martin Morrison. And I will now, oh, Martin, can I ask you to turn your camera on, please, so I can spotlight you?
Sure, how's that?
There it is, perfect. Just need to, there he is. Okay, play spotlight. There you are, and now I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, very good. I'm just gonna work here. Can everyone see my shared screen?
Yes. Although I can see your whole screen, if you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Yeah.
Ooh, I don't want that. Is that better or no?
I can see all the slides down on the left-hand side.
I think Martin, at the bottom, you need to click start the slideshow at the very bottom.
Does that work now?
Yes, perfect, yes.
Okay, so I took a bit of a different approach. I looked through the pieces that were sent out. Particularly, I pulled out a number of components from the introduction, from Pinar's comments on Ashwani's work from the overall book. And I started almost immediately applying the concept of meditative inquiry into just kind of items that I would be applying in my practice. So just to give you a bit of background, I was an RCH coordinator for a school board in the province of Nova Scotia. And so RCH stands for Race Relations, Cross-Cultural Understanding and Human Rights. And so a lot of the lenses that I interpret and view kind of the conversations always generally defaults to the public education system. And so I'll start with the territorial acknowledgement that we was pretty kind of progressive, I'll say, in the public education system at the time, because RCH coordinators, we were designated with kind of the responsibility to make sure that we had a kind of consistent message with respect to the acknowledgement. And there were a lot of questions in terms of the implications of the territorial acknowledgement as it relates to what many would characterize as a hidden curriculum. And so those pieces had to be vetted and approved by the Department of Education of Nova Scotia. And so once again, something that has historically been quite progressive in the sense of what it was up against at the time has now kind of introduced a few more questions. So I'll start with the territorial acknowledgement. Mount St. Vincent University exists within Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Lenape Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqey Maliseet people first signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties did not deal with surrendered lands and resources, but in fact, recognized Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqey title sovereignty and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. All MSVU course interactions, whether online or physically held at the university, benefit from the use of the stolen Indigenous land. And so I introduced this, I was recently hired last year as the assistant professor and teaching the BD program. And so one of the things in terms of, a concern around performative allyship and just reading things as wrote was to really try to challenge folks to engage in terms of what is being said as it relates to the territorial acknowledgement, because when you think about unceded, you think about stolen Indigenous land, that's relatively strong language. This is used at a university level, and I question to think how that might be interpreted in a public school context, and we see the implications of kind of some of the hesitancy around really centering Eurocentrism and colonial ideologies that's occurring in the States with the backlash against critical race theory and the demonstration by DeSantis in terms of protecting white students generally from harm as it relates to racialized conversations. And it speaks to me in terms of an acknowledgement of where we're at, and that the system seems to be okay with the continued trauma and harm that exists for racialized learners who seldom have an opportunity to have their story told in the nuance and the accuracy that would validate and affirm the lived experiences and the inequities that they experience from a racialized perspective. So one of the things in terms of locating myself in the context of this conversation is from a Bob Marley quote, and it goes, "Some people got everything, some people got nothing. Some people got hopes and dreams, some people got ways and means." So in a few of the other presentations, I've heard the expression of narratives and location of where people come from. And one of the things that really kind of struck me was my experiences and going to school was the center of the world, in that you needed to take yourself to school so you could get yourself an education, with the idea that you could self-actualize. You'd have opportunities to explore the world that's out there. The public education system would provide you these opportunities. And then you have an opportunity through that same process to find, the opportunity or the ability to find gainful employment from that. So I start with that because coming from a small rural community, an African Scotian community that were generally situated on the outskirts of towns, there was this kind of phenomenon that occurred with respect to the talent and potential that I saw existing in my community, that people were living in spite of systemic challenges that they were experiencing, and the disconnect between, say, for example, learners would get to grade 7, grade 8, 9, and some students would fall off. They wouldn't be in public school anymore, and then very few of us graduated. And I think my school year was actually probably one of the higher numbers of graduates that year of African ancestry. But to my point, it's there is this backdrop that is kind of the water that we swim in, for lack of a better term. That is there. It's not necessarily kind of brought up, and so when you experience it, there's a dissonance between what you're experiencing and what the messaging about schools are, or school is. So Ubuntu, I am because you are. And so when we talk about really kind of critically reflecting on our identity and how we arrived, these things kind of locate me in terms of giving a context in terms of lived experiences, developing a sense of pride and centeredness with respect to the legacy of resistance and resiliency of the community, and that communal element that's a very strong cultural component as it relates to my community, that I wouldn't be who I am without my community. So Ubuntu, which means I am because you are. So there's a reciprocal interconnectedness. So in reading the forward, Meditative inquiry, Ashwani Kumar in this volume explains, is the art of understanding oneself and one's relationship to people and the world, adding that it honors our existential quest as human beings from time immemorial to ask fundamental questions about the meaning, origin, and purpose of life. And so for me, that meaning, origin, and purpose of life evolved for me as in terms of becoming a teacher. And it kind of happened inadvertently in the sense that I graduated, I didn't necessarily have the best marks, I wanted to figure out what I wanted to do. And I ended up going to community college and becoming a program support assistant. And that transformational kind of element of finding out what I wanted to do was that fire. I think someone spoke earlier about the difference between the dumping of knowledge versus that creation of fire. And that created a fire in me in terms of I work with marginalized, vulnerable learners, not necessarily racialized, but that require support. And I felt like I was contributing something that I thought I could transfer beyond levels of PSA. And so I went back to school and became a teacher. And so another transformative component, as you'll have read the article, is chapter 3 is written by Dr. Brigham. Dr. Brigham happens to be my supervisor in the PhD program right now. And she, along with a number of other folks, were responsible for developing an Afrocentric cohort. And it was a graduate studies in lifelong learning with a focus on Afrocentricity. And so the opportunity for 20 learners, educators of African descent from across the province to come together. And this is something that really kind of stuck with me in terms of the resistance that I would receive with respect to contextualizing the lived experiences and the pushback that I would receive to be in a place, because I had done an undergrad, I had done a BD program, and nothing like this in my educational experience ever existed. In that we were able to unapologetically place our cultural values, beliefs, and lived experiences at the center of our conversations, our discussions, our studies in a safe, supportive, affirming environment. And so it enabled an opportunity, a transformation from, I guess I always had in my mind an intention of subversively getting into the education system and trying to do those intangible things that would be responsive to issues of inequity. But I saw education at that time as a credential or hurdle that I had to jump. And then once I jumped that hurdle in terms of the systemic operation, then once I was situated where I needed to be, I could do those things. The idea was that prior to the Afrocentric cohort, there were challenges with fully actualizing a response, because in terms of coming through an education system, you often default to the way that you were taught. And so the cultural values of the institutions and the people who represent that institution, to a certain extent, I would argue I internalized. So I generally felt and accepted that I had to convince white people who represented white institutions and colonial values and beliefs of my reality. And prior to that, as an educator, I felt like I had to do it from a place of conciliation. So I couldn't be too forward, I couldn't be too confrontational, because my ultimate goal was to provide whatever supports or interventions that were required from learners, and it required a bit of navigation. However, after the Afrocentric cohort, I was able to be more explicit about the intentionality regarding my understanding and role as a teacher, and seeking to redress these inequities, starting with racism and experiences of learners of African descent. So we have self-identification information for students that disproportionately show that African Nova Scotian learners, Indigenous learners are lower in standardized test scores provincially, and they encounter more school climate challenges in terms of disproportionate suspension rates and non-academic strains. So this opportunity provided an opportunity to delve deeper, explore and articulate the challenges and barriers associated with these inequities and explore solutions, because my energy as an educator wasn't wrapped up in talking to people who were in leadership or positions of authority, and first convincing them of my reality, and then having them collaboratively work with me to come up with a solution. It was an opportunity for it just to be what it was in terms of the conversation, and say, what can we do and how do we go about, being responsive to these issues as they exist. So while I recognize the positionality of whiteness and white supremacy as a barrier to systemic equities, I no longer concede to its authority in limiting an expression of truth about racism and its implications on racialized learners. And so I will say in that context that I'm no longer in the position that I was in prior to this position that I'm in, because the challenges with kind of having that mentality, having that mind frame, while it does reduce your fear, you start to feel like you might be required to take your talents elsewhere as it relates to being more impactful as it relates to those things. And so the two things that pop for me with respect to Ashwani's work was the meditative inquiry is a process of clearing blockages within you. It breaks down conditioning, fear of authority, fear of life, fear of anything. It is not a conscious process, but the deeper you go, the deeper the roots of the blockages will be broken. When there are no blockages, life will rush out.
That's a 3-minute warning. Okay, Ms. Morrison? Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So meditative inquiry allows one to see clearly and deeply how colonial, ideological, and neoliberal influence is characterized by, but not limited to, racial prejudices, political control, or education, economistic and superficial view operate within one's self as one relates to others in the day-to-day living. And so it was just very powerful to see that transformative, the implications of a transformative process that was characterized and articulated from a meditative inquiry perspective. And so like I said, my initial introduction to meditative inquiries is pretty early on, but those components and their alignment with Afrocentricity, and Dr. Brigham speaks to that in her chapter, was a very kind of powerful revelation. So a revelation for me. And so I wanted to just kind of explore that a little bit. And so what I'll say in terms of closing kind of this part of the conversation up, and we really didn't get into the cultural relevant responsive component of it, is that I had a question and I asked it earlier in terms of the implications of meditative inquiry in terms of being a delving of deeper critical reflection. If Afrocentricity and, say, for example, culture responsive pedagogy could be applied in that context as a framework for meditative inquiry. And so the challenge is that I was kind of, and the reason why I was wondering whether that framework could work and the potential implications of that is that there's the culture responsive pedagogy, from my findings, requires a mechanism to really engage and challenge educators to reflect on what knowledge is of most worth to whom. And if they're not cognizant of the fact that the Eurocentric structure and colonial institutions have structured education and in a way that serves privileged learners, then that realization, that revelation, aside from a lived experience, is going to be more challenging. And so that's kind of the core of my introduction to meditative inquiry, my experiences as a student in the Afrocentric cohort, and my current research in culture responsive pedagogy, which starts with kind of the idea that teachers will work with students and support their academic success, that they will support students to be culturally competent, which means to not only know themselves and center their understanding of themselves culturally, but learn one other culture. So it works to communicate across differences. And then finally, that will engender a social political consciousness that works or seeks for emancipatory kind of actions so that people can be their full selves holistically. And so at this point in the presentation, given the time frame, I'll close it off. Thank you so much. Thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin Morrison. I'm going to ask you, Darlene St. George, to please turn your camera on. And Mr. Morrison, what I'm going to say is that, again, as with everyone, at the end, I'll bring you back in for the Q&A, and so everyone will be spotlighted at that time. Okay. So you are centered, and now I will just take one moment to remove the spotlight from Martin Morrison. Okay, you're on.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Just give me a moment, and if you could confirm that you can see it well.
Yes, I can see it well.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm just so very delighted to be invited to participate on this panel for holistic and contemplative education in support of Dr. Hashwani Kumar's important work and recent edited collection called Engaging in Meditative Inquiry and Teaching, Learning and Research. My name is Darlene St. George. I'm a visual artist, poet, creation-centered scholar and educator. I am assistant professor of art education with the University of Lethbridge in Southern Alberta on the land and territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy. I'm also a co-editor along with Dr. Barbara Bickle of Artizine, Arts and Teaching Journal, which is a special international journal that supports art-centered research and pedagogy. I've been on this journey in my academic career of weaving my artistic practices, ideals, and ideas into my pedagogical practice and research. The arts, creative capacity, spirit, storying, and alternative ways of knowing and being are really what I've made of. That's the fiber of my being. I've been very fortunate and grateful to work collaboratively with Dr. Alexandra Fidyk, who is part of this panel. She's with the University of Alberta. She is a fellow creative and philosopher. Our most recent project as guest editors with Arts Research International is called Poetic Inquiry for Synchrony and Love, a New Order of Gravity, a special issue coming out shortly, along with edited book collections. So very exciting work. And I bring these forward because I've come to realize that academia can be a hard place for creatives. And so I can't say enough how important it is to build, honor, nurture, and support each other in our beautiful and rich artistic creative scholarship relationships. And so in that way, I truly appreciate Dr. Kumar's offering, his work on meditative inquiry. And as he says, quote, we, with the capital W, individuals, traditions, and communities around the globe who focus on exploring truth, beauty, and sacredness from deep within are all flowers of a grander meditative quest or journey. This statement and the work brings warmth to my heart and touches me personally while on this, at times, arduous journey of finding my academic family. As an artist and deeply spiritual person, artistic approaches, and worse, spiritual approaches are often met with contempt in academia, challenging me on a personal level to speak out or to step out in creative ways and capacities. So thank you, Hashwani, for supporting us with your precious work and challenges, recognizing the creative, spiritual, and performative ways of our being in the world and being with the world. And so in my presentation, I'm going to begin with sharing a creation story that I created. Afterwards, I'll speak to creation-centered research and some of the critical and nourishing parallels and alignments I find with meditative inquiry. And again, so thank you very much for this opportunity. And so I'll just click to the next slide. Breathing into her slowed blood, acidity grew fear in her gut, remembering the break. Being pulled across lands and rivers, down hills, over bridges, along edges of towns lined with wet rocks. Slanting sideways. transfixed in silences and unraveling lines of existence, assemblages of shadows and meandering memories found their way to her through windows and openings. Breathing into her slowed blood with stillness, she chewed with radical root and DNA obsession. Chewing and churning, chewing, chewing, chewing and churning and churning, chewing and churning, churning, chewing. Weaving primordial fluid with electrifying energy till transmuted poison poured from her mouth. Bitter contradictions. Rising up, she spit. She spit hard, she spit long, she spit deep, coercing the heavy oiled secretion deep into the earth. Shifting gravity. Breathing into her slowed blood in her solitude with spruce and rivers and creeks and roads. Windswept, she became what she loved. Fluid silver keys dangling between points, sitting on the edge of light before daybreak. Fluent, slick. Maeve is a creation story of living, surviving and evolving through layered complexities of being. It is a dreaming and a counter-narrative of becoming through agency and ancestral connection. Creation stories are rooted in epistemologies that recognize and attend to the interconnections between making, learning, and knowing through the entanglements and relationships of self with other, including human and non-human beings. Maeve illustrates the embodiment of creation-centered research, which relies on creative, experiential engagement and intra-action. It builds upon relational connectivity and engages with embodied and lived experience. It is uniquely rooted in métissage, poetic inquiry, and storying, and leans into some arts-based practices. The term creation-centered reflects the ontological and cyclical nature of artistic practices and supports its creative intention and integrity. It is situated in an animated, aesthetic, creation-centered paradigm. Creation-centered research honors creative beingness and considers life force, creative life force, a conduit for retelling our cosmic story, a restoration of knowledges and knowing, ancient and ethereal. Like meditative inquiry, it is an art of becoming aware, listening deeper through aesthetic and artistic engagement. It acknowledges and honors other forms of knowing, myth, creation stories, animals, dreams, art, and ancestors, literacies of the imaginal, metaphoric, and the sensual. Creation-centered métissage is the method of creation-centered research. It uses artistic threads, visual image, text, and storying, and at times sonic elements to navigate and explore the inward-outward journey. In this way, it is a storying praxis that weaves the mysteries of creative insight, wonderment, somatic knowledge, intuition, memories, dreams, imagination, vision, and it seeks to integrate the wisdom from the ancients with the present. In this aesthetic engagement and creation-centered process, it offers insight into Kumar's critical question about the relationship between the arts and spirituality and the role of intuition and intrinsic intelligences in the process of knowledge creation. In this way, it relinquishes colloquial aesthetic constraints and invites complexity and deeper realms of knowing and being, which can include fragmentations, bits and pieces, holes, gaps, and silences.
This is a 3-minute warning.
Creation-centered métissage offers a method of braiding poetry, image, fragments, myth, and verse. It mixes, juxtaposes, challenges, and hosts an artful research practice. Specifically and importantly, it offers a rapprochement between mainstream curriculum discourse and, like meditative inquiry, it seeks a sincere dialogue. Creation-centered research offers a critical space for much needed unraveling, relearning, and rediscovering to take place. It offers a way to engage with learning outside of traditional frameworks, where rather than studying an object or concept, one can experience it. Thank you, Ashwani, so much for your brave meditative inquiry work and ushering us into a sense of freedom and a celebration of freedom at the highest principles of teaching, learning, and living. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Dr. St. George. And so now I would ask all the presenters to please turn your cameras on so I can spotlight you and bring you in to take part in this conversation. Okay, so I can start here. Just ask for your patience while I work my way through. And here we are. Now, you will also notice, everyone, the chat is now open. So everyone is free to give it some thought and ask your questions. Everyone will be able to see that from the chat, but I'll also have a look. I'll read them out to you if you're not able to see the chat. But in the meantime, while everyone is creating their questions, I ask the 4 of you presenters, do you have any questions or comments for each other on each other's presentations or your thinking processes or even the book that you're all sharing your discussions on? You can feel free to open your mics and just have a conversation.
Well, I just want to say, it's just so amazing to have all the different perspectives and lenses coming through. I really appreciated everybody's presentations. Thank you.
The same here. It's been very inspiring. I've been taking lots of notes, and this has really been very inspiring. Thank you for your presentations.
Well, I have definitely thoroughly enjoyed your presentations. And Darlene, that was one of the purposes for this conference, to open it up so that a lot of folks, because I think some other people mentioned, right, that they have been engaged in their own meditative inquiry. They may have a different name or no name. And it's just, it was an opportunity for me to invite folks who could share and talk about and just explore connections. So I'm really glad.
That's great.
And Darlene, I love the artwork in your presentation.
Thank you so much.
It's reminiscent a little bit of the beautiful artwork in the edited volume as well. It's I find some beautiful connections somehow with the beautiful artwork that was, we could say, that was beautifully introduced as well and articulated this morning by the artist.
Thank you. I need to say that a lot of the images were photographs that I took of the crows in my yard when they had their chicks, and they were ferociously hunting. And it was during COVID, so I was housebound, and I became intimately connected with their lives, and of course triggering my own imagination and so on. So it was a beautiful opportunity to bring that forward.
Yes, go. You just unmute yourself. There you are.
Okay, very good. I'm just wondering what fellow panelists' thoughts are with respect to the implications of power, the impact of like neoliberal colonial intrusion in the education that limits resources for exactly what kind of the core of what Ashwani, I think, is talking about, the whole child. Because culturally responsive pedagogy is orientated in terms of creating spaces within classrooms where learners can express their full selves, while at the same time access kind of a core agreed upon understanding and navigate, negotiate that. So I was just wondering and thinking, you know, where we're in this world where there's always and assertion of power dynamics and, you know, limited, quote unquote, limited resources. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are with respect to the implications of public education as it relates to those pieces in holistic education.
Are you posing that question to me, Martin?
It could be for anyone, really. I just want to get a sense of, like, I feel my experience has been that there is a lot of kind of pushback to anything that's understood that's peripheral to what someone has identified as being a core element of the curriculum. And when we're talking about I think Latson Billings has an article called "It's Time for a Hard Reset," given the exacerbation of inequities after COVID, et cetera, et cetera. And I just wanted to get a sense of either, you know, from the panelists or from you, Ashwani, the thoughts are with respect to knowing where we need or want to go with respect to caring for the whole student, and sometimes the temptation of systems just to blast through with those who will get it will get it. So education becomes sorting and ranking as opposed to educating or caring for.
I will let panelists engage, and if need be, I'll jump in. I have responses, but I would rather let you folks engage.
Maybe I can share a couple of thoughts in case Darlene and Alexandra don't have something to share for now. But maybe just a couple of thoughts, Martin. I think this is a wonderful question, and I think it also resonates a little bit with a question in the chat about that one of our participants is sharing a little bit about that space in academia and how it could be restricted, but still also a space for empowerment and so on. My sense, and maybe going back to my own presentation and where maybe where my thinking is with meditative inquiry and some of the questions, I think one of the approaches, Martin, would be that in terms of holistic education, I think part of the question needs to be, and also going back to that connection that that's been also outlined for us in the 8th volume and by Ashwani, that between our own consciousness, but also systems and structures and historical injustices and so on, and trying to find spaces to reconcile and address some of these inequities and so on. I would say that one thing that holistic education offers to that as well, or that it needs to keep in mind, is also the multi-layered maybe distortion or lenses that have been in place and the various discourses that have distorted our relationship with some of these knowledge systems and these cultural knowledge systems, and these, whether these are ancient wisdom traditions, indigenous, Afrocentrist, and so on. So I think that maybe I would just say that it would be important that part of this conversation that we need to foreground. I think sometimes we reduce the conversation to maybe modern colonialism, but we don't maybe necessarily look at the role of dominant religious institutions, and maybe the role of some of those, and maybe how some of those have negated or distanced people from their indigenous ways of knowing and being across various parts of the world. How have syncretic, for instance, practices been frowned upon by maybe some of scholars of the Enlightenment, and later how it's been also taken up by modern education. So I think my only comment here would be, I think it would be helpful in terms of in the spirit of holistic education, is to also adopt a more holistic approach and multi-perspective approach when we're grappling with some of these questions, so that the outcome would be a little bit more holistic and multi-perspective as well, as opposed to maybe addressing one dimension of that issue. And sorry to use the word outcome, I feel a little bit that I'm internalizing neoliberal. Thank you for the question.
Dr. Fidyk and Dr. St. George, do you have a comment to make?
The only thing that I was going to add is that I think as long as the people making decisions and thinking about policy and education are still in a ontology or in a worldview that's binary, that we're caught with some of these extensions, right? So I think for me, a lot of this is continuously challenging the what we call it, the etho-ontical, epistemology, or we're calling it just ontological. I think the paradigm in which most of education is still very problematic. It's lagging, it's binary, it's still divisive. And as long as people are thinking through that lens, then there will be sorting and labeling, and there will be an us, them. That's what I think it is that we have to unroad. And the very act of education and learning and the teacher training systems, is bringing in, what are the worldviews? Like where does meditative inquiry sit? It can't sit in a post-positivist paradigm. It can't even sit, I don't believe, in postmodern paradigms, because it has a meta-narrative. It has a sense of wholeness and becoming, right? It's located in particular views of the world. And I think there's a clash here, because most education systems are still locked in, binary standpoints. So it's hard to address the outcome of that without still unpacking the back end. That's how I see it.
Yeah, I can certainly relate to that from that angle as an artist, an art educator. Prior to academia, I was in teaching high school art for 10, 12 years. I can't remember. If you think about the Alberta programs of study where they're labeling the arts, for instance, as options, they're not even titled, as an example. So it is this constant struggle, this constant push back as an artist, art educator, against those systems that are very embedded, for sure. And as Alex pointed out, it's very, very important to really reconsider, perhaps even meditate upon, what is the ontological lens? What is the paradigm through which we are looking? I think that's a very critical point. Yeah. In response to your question, Dr. Martin.
Can I just make a quick point? I think that is such an important discussion. You know, what happens in public school system, in my view, is that they respond to the crisis. If there is an indigenous crisis, they will say, okay, we need to create some space for that. If there is some other crisis, then we need to create some space for that. But I don't think there is a fundamental discussion on the ontological and epistemological perspectives in which it is rooted, right? That would be a fundamental inquiry. And I don't think anybody is interested in doing that, especially the people in public school system. And I would say even in the universities, very few people are really interested in, okay, let's talk about what is it that we are actually doing in the name of education. Very few people are interested in that. People have their solutions. Psychologists have their own solutions. Other people, everybody have their solutions, how to solve the problem. But I think we are like unwilling to ask some hard questions. Nell Noddings talks about aim talk, right? Do we talk about what are the aims of education? Well, it's very, very rare to have that kind of discussion. As soon as you begin that, it becomes very superficial. It's become, as soon as you talk about education, it's always looked at from an instrumentalist sense. What is it going to get you? So
Yeah.
Just that much, won't speak too much, but I think we really need to have a fundamental exploration, which we don't do.
Agreed. Yeah, so I think forward into, you know, how do I bring in and the ways that I bring in creation-centered research and creation-centered métissage and creation storying, bring that in. Where does it fit into the curriculum? Those are the questions, of course, that I will get back that I need to respond to, right? So, but that's not to say I wouldn't bring it in.
Mhm. I just kind of want to extend that and go back to Ashwani's comment about ontology. You know, I've been teaching the doctoral research series here at U of A for several years, and I really spend a lot of time on historical paradigms, right? Like in the Western world and in other worldviews, what predates 1500s, right? What were the ways of knowing and doing, and what were the values? And so I say to the students, we can't just say chapter 3 is research methodology. We must begin, what is one's worldview or paradigm? And from there, we can move towards approach, methodology, methods, etc. But so many still, they struggle to get that, right? Because the assumption is that we all live in this worldview. And it's still predominantly post-positivist. Why? Because it's binary. It's research and participant. And the world that holds that, whether we call it a creative impulse, whether we look at it as holy or prayer or whatever from our different worldviews, that is still, I think, an ongoing challenge in everything that we've been talking about. And that's why I think into these places where we really can't move, where we can't make lasting change for sorting and labeling. Why? Because it's still seen as a world where labels work. And until that's interrogated and destabilized, and there's another place from which we can extend in our learning and teaching, we will continue to be, I think, frustrated by repetition of the same.
Yeah. It's a really good point, and I reflect actually on the previous panel and the discussion that came up around journals and how journals are, you know, receiving articles or the checkbox lists of what's accepted in terms of chapters and the challenges that, you know, the output challenges or criteria or drive, let's say that. And I was really happy to hear some of the panel in the previous panelists talking about what are alternative ways that we can bring in. And I know Alex and I have had these kinds of conversations, you know, what are the alternative ways that we can lift up alternative approaches to research.
and even like reviewing and publication and all that, right? Because the model that we are working, I feel, is so not good. It's so Eurocentric. It's like the way we accept the publications, the way they are reviewed, and the wall of the peer review. The reviewer can say anything. Sometimes editors don't mediate that you are not supposed to be saying this. This is not right thing to say to any author. I have been a victim of that too. So in this book we adopted a more dialogical kind of interaction, which I experienced it. One of another, I actually artisan issue. I published a paper when Barbara Bickle and Susan Walsh edited a special issue, and that was created through a more dialogical process. We adopted that process and intensified it even in the creation of this book. So I
Wonderful.
really need to question, but what I feel is that there are a lot of people who I have met who seem to be very stuck with what they think is the right way of writing, right way of publication, right venue of publication. I see those kinds of resistances at all levels. That there is a particular way. If you fit into that, then it's easy. Having said that, folks have created a lot of alternative options as well. Artisan is one option, and the panelists that we had in the previous panel. So there are a lot of other alternative voices as well, but the traditional voices also, traditional or how should I say, the predominant voices are also there. They're pretty strong.
I see a question in the chat from Dr. Ritchie. At 5:02, I think.
Yes, I think Dr. Abdou made a reference to that earlier, but I'll read it out. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your voices. I'm curious, acknowledging that academia can be restrictive, at the same time, it makes space for academic freedom and a space to have voice to name inequities. Any reflections on this?
I can give it a go as a newbie. I think, going back to the whole conversation with respect to kind of the conditioning that you experience and aspiring to that liberty that Dr. Ashwani had mentioned around the floodgates opening with respect to challenging and being centered from a perspective. I think for me, it's one of those components of strategically speaking into that void. And so, as much as, I'll even say, like, I'm in a perpetual state of decolonizing my mind, because there are things that I really want to be critically want to challenge and work out for myself prior to kind of really taking on an institution, that provides you gainful employment. So, I think that I will exercise that extension of my thoughts through meditative inquiry and Afrocentrism and cultural responsiveness and anti-Black racism, academic exploration. Yeah, I think it's something that is, requires a serious conversation, because as much as the conversation kind of evolves in terms of being very blunt and very forward, the conditions on the ground don't necessarily change, right? So you have people who are able to learn and perform certain responses to questions, asking about diversity. But when it lands, when questions of diversity, or even equity hires land at universities, there's a potential backlash, and there's an extra level of scrutiny that relates to some systemic historical racist tropes around competencies and abilities and what constitutes scholarship and all those kind of conversations. And I mean, even manifests when you think about student assessments. I think there's data and research that exists there when it comes to racialized professors and submissions of student evaluations that create a barrier right from the beginning, because let's not kid ourselves. These are long-standing, heavily resourced perceptions you know, that kind of outspend any other kind of counter narrative to that messaging. And it's exemplified through the invisibility of contributing factors, like I was, you know, when I was talking earlier about, you know, what the land acknowledgement or territorial acknowledgement could do with respect to, okay, let's put it on the table and really get into saying, you know, talking about the moral bankruptcy of colonial values that would exploit and you know, based on predatory capitalism and et cetera, but there's this kind of acknowledgement, but it's a softer version of how hard you could go at the issue. And so I think those things are important in terms of getting and building a critical mass or a capacity of people to speak, a critical mass of people to speak back to those issues. So that's my thoughts.
I hope, I mean, I hope everybody is reading the comments that are coming through the chat. And if you haven't, I hope you take the opportunity to, because some of them have given quite in-depth feedback on some of the ideas that you have all shared. You can scroll back through it if you haven't read it already. That is the end of our last session of the day, of the first session of the first day, sorry, of the last session of the first day of the 3-day conference. Ashwani, I'm not sure if you want to say any last remarks.
Thank you so much, Darlene, Ehaab, and Martin and Alex for your wonderful presentation. I'm quite thoroughly enjoying all the discussions. Well, very happy to see the first day concluded. Thanks so much to Bonnie and Ellie and Ian to be doing the work in front and center and also in the background. And yeah, very happy, very nice first day. And everybody, all the sessions are video recorded, so we will make them available to you. So if you didn't watch something, you can watch it. If you want to watch something again, you can watch it, or watch it wherever you want it, or don't watch it. All the options are so thank you so much. I think, yeah, Bonnie, we are ready to conclude it, and I hope to see some of you and all of you tomorrow, and we'll continue with the discussion. Tomorrow we will, most of the panels will be the folks who authored the chapters in the books. So if you want to know what happened in the book, it would be a wonderful idea to see it. And the last panel will be a teacher's panel. So we are looking forward to it.
Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you. Take care.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
See you tomorrow.